Our first meeting happened just a few weeks into my very first job after graduating college. Surprisingly, securing that position hadn't been as tough as I'd imagined. After juggling multiple internships, I felt deeply grateful to those who had pushed me to pursue further education, even when I was skeptical about their advice. Despite my initial doubts, I stuck with it, and eventually I graduated with honors, a milestone I would always cherish. Stephanie, or Steph as she preferred to be called, was thriving in her own right. She worked as an assistant at a high-end boutique that catered to an affluent clientele. With 2 years of experience under her belt, she'd seamlessly settled into the role and seemed to genuinely enjoy both her work and the people she interacted with daily. We met by sheer chance one afternoon. Steph had decided to grab lunch at a small cafe near her workplace, and I happened to be there as well. She was sitting with a friend at the table next to mine, and at one point her friend turned to me, asking if I could pass the sugar. Naturally, I obliged, and their warm smiles lit up the moment. A short while later, as fate would have it, I realized I needed sugar for my own coffee. Instead of simply reaching for it, I stood up, walked over to their table, and asked for it. That's when Steph, clearly in a playful mood, grinned mischievously and hid the sugar container in her lap, claiming they didn't have any. Her antics sparked a laugh from all of us. After a moment, she retrieved the sugar, apologized for the joke, and invited me to join them. I couldn't resist the invitation. After introductions, we chatted casually about our jobs, favorite TV shows, and even live performances we enjoyed. It was lighthearted and fun, but soon enough they both had to get back to work. As they stood to leave, they thanked me for the conversation and walked out. I watched them go, feeling a little flutter in my chest. It had only been a brief encounter, but their company left me smiling. As I stood to leave, my eyes caught sight of a small plastic bag under the table, one that Steph had been looking through while we were talking. Realizing she must have left it behind, I quickly decided to return it. Fortunately, I remembered where she worked, and with a few minutes to spare before my break ended, I made my way to her boutique. When I arrived and told her about the bag, her surprise was evident. She was even more shocked to realize she'd left it behind. Something she said was out of character for her. She thanked me profusely, explaining that the bag contained special accessories for one of her clients, items she couldn't afford to lose. After returning the bag, I turned to leave, but Steph called me back. She thanked me again and asked if she could buy me a drink after work as a token of appreciation. Of course, I accepted, and we agreed to meet at a local bar later that evening. That afternoon, I couldn't get Steph, or even her friend, out of my mind. Initially, her friend had caught my attention more, but as the hours ticked by, I realized it was Steph who truly intrigued me. I found myself counting down the minutes until I could see her again. When I arrived at the bar, I wasn't sure if she would actually show up. I'd been stood up before, so I tried not to get my hopes up. Thankfully, I didn't have to wait long. Steph rushed in with a bright smile, apologizing for making me wait and explaining she'd hurried to get there on time. We ordered drinks and found a quiet corner to talk. The conversation flowed effortlessly, and time seemed to fly. Steph mentioned how relieved she was that I'd returned her bag. It had contained some important items for a client, and losing it would have been disastrous. Hearing how much I'd helped her made me feel unexpectedly proud. After a couple of rounds of drinks, I noticed how late it had gotten and suggested we grab dinner. Steph agreed enthusiastically, and we headed to a nearby steakhouse. Over our meal, we grew even more comfortable with each other. By the end of dinner, I couldn't deny that I was growing quite fond of her. As we walked back to her apartment, Steph mentioned she had a flatmate who would be home, a subtle way of letting me know she wasn't inviting me up. Still, the walk was wonderful. Somewhere along the way, she slipped her hand into mine, and we held hands the rest of the way. When we reached her building, Steph turned to me with a smile, saying it had been a fantastic evening. She leaned in to hug me, and when I kissed her lightly on the cheek, she didn't pull away. When her lips brushed mine, even for a fleeting moment, I felt like $1,000,000. We said goodnight soon after, and I made sure she got safely inside her front door before hailing a taxi to take me home. My flat was about 5 miles from hers, a modest place I lived in by myself. During dinner, Stephanie had written down her phone numbers, both her work and home lines, and told me to call her soon. I decided to wait a couple of days before making the call. Part of me wanted to give the impression that I wasn't overly eager, and another part thought that a little suspense might make her even more excited to hear from me. Assuming all went well, of course. Let me tell you, those 2 days felt like an eternity. It took every ounce of willpower to hold off, but when the time finally came, I dialed her work number, figuring it would be easier to keep the conversation short and straightforward while she was busy. I reasoned that a brief chat might make it easier for her to say yes to another dinner. The moment she answered the phone, I could hear the excitement in her voice. It was unmistakable and completely genuine. Within minutes, we'd made plans to meet that evening, though she asked for a little extra time to head home first and change. She mentioned it was a special occasion and wanted to look her best, which left me both flattered and curious. I decided to follow her lead and took a taxi home to freshen up. 2. I wanted to make an impression. When we met at the restaurant, I'd arrived just a minute or so before her. Stephanie walked in, and I was immediately struck by how stunning she looked. She'd clearly gone to a lot of effort, and it showed. Her black cocktail dress was short, ending well above her knees, with a slightly low-cut neckline held up by delicate spaghetti straps. She paired it with heels that made her legs look incredible and had even had her hair styled. She looked radiant, and I couldn't help but wonder why she'd gone to so much trouble. Not that I was complaining. I wasn't looking too bad myself, if I do say so. I'd swapped my work clothes for a casual lounge suit, and it felt good to know we made a sharp-looking pair. The maitre d' escorted us to a cozy, semi-private table, and we were handed menus. Not that we were particularly focused on them. Most of the time we were sneaking glances at each other around the edges of the menus like a couple of nervous teenagers. I told her how beautiful she looked, and I swear she blushed. It was clear she'd gone out of her way to make the evening special. As we waited for our meals, we chatted easily. Stephanie shared that she'd only been living in the city for a year. Before that, she'd spent her entire life in the countryside. There was a charming simplicity about her that I found incredibly appealing. She admitted she'd never had a serious boyfriend before, despite having plenty of offers. She explained that she was shy and didn't want to date anyone unless she genuinely liked them, unless they were someone she could imagine spending her life with. That thought hit me like a lightning bolt. Did she see me as that kind of person? I couldn't help but wonder. For my part, I dated quite a few girls before, but nothing ever got serious. Sure, there had been some kissing and light petting, but nothing beyond that. As the conversation flowed, I began to suspect that Stephanie was still a virgin. It wasn't something we discussed openly, but I couldn't help thinking about how rare it seemed for two people our age, me at 26 and her at 25, to still be in that boat. Time slipped away from us, and before we knew it, the restaurant was closing. The evening had flown by, and it felt like we were the only two people in the world. It seemed like the perfect moment to ask her out again. Before I'd even finished the question, she'd already said yes. Things were definitely happening between us, and I could feel it. Since her flat was nearby, we decided to walk again. This time, she took my hand almost immediately, and before long, my arm was around her waist. I was falling for her, no doubt about it. When we reached her building, she surprised me by asking if I'd like to come up and meet her flatmate. I agreed, curious about the person Stephanie shared her life with. Inside, her flatmate, Dell, was sitting on the couch watching TV. It was pretty clear she'd stayed up intentionally to meet me. Probably some sort of inspection. Dell greeted me warmly, and we hit it off right away. Stephanie offered to make coffee, and as she disappeared into the kitchen, Dell took the opportunity to chat. It was obvious she cared deeply for Stephanie and wanted to make sure I had good intentions. I didn't mind the scrutiny. In fact, I appreciated it. It was easy to convince Dell that I had nothing but respect for Stephanie, and by the time the coffee was ready, I felt like I'd passed whatever unspoken test I was taking. Dell seemed to approve, and that meant the world to me. While Stephanie was out of earshot, Dell leaned in and asked me for my work phone number. She mentioned wanting to call me the next day to talk about Stephanie. It seemed a bit unusual, but I quietly wrote my number on a card and handed it over. The three of us continued chatting for another hour, and before we knew it, the clock was nearing 1 a.m. I apologized, explaining that I needed to head home and get some sleep if I wanted to function at work the next day. They both laughed at my excuse but agreed it was getting late. Dell excused herself to her room, leaving Stephanie and me alone. She moved closer, gave me a tender goodnight kiss, and told me how much she'd enjoyed the evening. She said she was already looking forward to our next date, which I had smartly planned for 3 days later. I figured a little time apart would build anticipation for both of us. After a few more kisses, I said goodnight and headed home, where I fell into a deep sleep filled with dreams of Stephanie. The next day, true to her word, Dell called me at work. She asked if I had a moment to talk, and I assured her that I had my own office and wouldn't be interrupted. Without wasting time, she got straight to the point, asking if I was serious about Stephanie. "Stephanie's a special girl," she said. "She's too good to be messed around by someone who doesn't really care about her. If you're not serious, I'll do whatever it takes to protect her." Her directness caught me off guard. I hadn't expected Dell to be so blunt, but it was clear how much she cared for Stephanie. I reassured her that my intentions were genuine and that I was only interested in a long-term relationship, if Stephanie felt the same way. Dell softened a little and told me that Stephanie was already head over heels for me. Hearing that sent a wave of excitement through me, and I told Dell I felt exactly the same. I thanked her for looking out for Stephanie and promised I would treat her with the respect she deserved. Dell seemed satisfied with my answer and wished me well. She shared that she and Stephanie had been friends since kindergarten and had always looked out for each other. Before ending the call, she admitted she was surprised I hadn't tried to sleep with Stephanie the night before, given how late it was. I simply told her that I wasn't the type of person to rush into things and that I was willing to wait for the right time. Dell told me I'd done the right thing, and her approval meant more to me than I expected. Over the next 6 dates, Stephanie and I grew even closer. Our connection deepened with every outing, and it became clear that we were falling in love. On our 6th date, we had a heartfelt conversation and officially committed to a long-term relationship. Felt like everything was falling into place. Though our bond grew stronger, Stephanie was clear about wanting to wait before taking things to the next level physically, and I respected her wishes completely. After 6 months of steady dating, filled with conversations, shared experiences, and light affection, I proposed to her. She didn't hesitate for a second before saying yes. We decided to set the wedding date for 6 months later. During those months, Stephanie introduced me to her family, and I couldn't have asked for a warmer welcome. Her parents and siblings were wonderful, and I quickly felt like part of their family. Stephanie was overjoyed at how well everyone got along, and it only strengthened our love. I also introduced her to my family, who embraced her just as warmly. We both felt incredibly lucky to have such supportive families. Our wedding was a simple but beautiful affair, attended by our families and a few close friends. After the ceremony, we headed to the reception, where Dell, who was Stephanie's bridesmaid, pulled me aside. She confessed that at the beginning of our relationship, she'd been skeptical of my intentions. "I thought you might just be out to use Stephanie," she admitted. "But now, I can see how much you love her, and I couldn't be happier for both of you." She gave me a heartfelt hug and told me she was glad I'd proven her wrong. It was clear how close she and Stephanie were, and though I was becoming a central figure in Stephanie's life, Dell had fully accepted me. Our wedding night was nothing short of magical. We finally explored the depths of our love, and despite the initial awkwardness and a bit of pain when we crossed that first intimate threshold, it was worth the wait. Our honeymoon was just as wonderful. We traveled to several resorts, but honestly, we didn't see much of the sights. We were too caught up in each other, lost in a world of love and discovery. When we returned, we decided to live in my flat temporarily while we searched for a place that would be ours alone. Neither of us wanted to settle in a space that felt like it belonged to just one of us. After a couple of weeks, we found the perfect home, a charming, neutral place that we both loved, and started building our life together. Married life suited us perfectly. Our physical relationship blossomed as well. Both of us had been inexperienced, but we navigated the learning curve together, even purchasing a manual to better understand the nuances of intimacy. It might sound funny, but it helped us grow closer and more confident as a couple. Through it all, Dell remained a big part of our lives. Although she missed having Stephanie around as much as before, she was always supportive and stayed an important friend to both of us. I couldn't wrap my head around her logic. If she didn't want anyone to know about what she was planning, why on earth was she even considering it? It felt like her heated argument with Dell had only strengthened her resolve. Stephanie made it clear she was moving forward with her idea. She was preparing to sleep with another man, and there was no room for negotiation. Her mind was made up. For the next 2 weeks, I found myself watching her every move, looking for any sign that she was following through on this plan. But she kept her thoughts and intentions close, giving me no indication of what might come next. In the meantime, life carried on as usual. Our house was just a short distance from Dell's flat, so we saw her often. It wasn't much of a surprise when Dell eventually told us she'd met someone and was in love. Stephanie and I were genuinely happy for her. Dell deserved someone wonderful. The first 2 years of our marriage were almost picture-perfect. We both kept our jobs, and life was running smoothly. Stephanie had not only climbed the ranks to manage the boutique where she worked, but, with the blessing and support of the store's owner, we'd purchased another boutique in a nearby suburb. It was a dream come true, our very own fashion shop. Stephanie managed to balance both jobs beautifully, with the help of a talented young assistant who proved to be a great hire. But then, out of nowhere, our seemingly perfect life took a sharp turn. One night, Stephanie and I were lying in bed after making love. She propped herself up on one elbow, looked me straight in the eyes and said, "Darling, I'd like to make love to another man." I was stunned, completely blindsided. Felt like someone had hit me over the head with a hammer. I couldn't fathom why she would say such a thing. When I asked her to explain, she told me that Colleen, the girl managing our shop, had been talking to her about how exciting it was to sleep with different men. Colleen had apparently filled Stephanie's head with ideas about what she might be missing. "You'll never know what you're missing until you try," she had said. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Why was Stephanie even listening to Colleen? What could she possibly think was missing in our relationship? I tried to reason with her, to make her see how ridiculous this idea was, but nothing seemed to get through. Over the next month, she kept bringing it up, insisting on wanting to experience being with another man. It was like she couldn't let the idea go, no matter how much I tried to dissuade her. Desperate to put an end to this madness, I decided to confront Colleen directly. I went to the shop and told her she needed to stop filling Stephanie's head with such nonsense. But Colleen was unapologetic. She openly defended her lifestyle, telling me how much she enjoyed being with different men and how each one brought something unique to the table. "I'm not telling Stephanie to leave you," she said. "I'm just saying she should try something different for herself." Her words left me furious. We parted on bad terms, and while I hoped she'd stop influencing Stephanie, it was clear she wasn't going to change her views. At home, Stephanie kept pressuring me. She accused me of being insecure, asking if I was afraid she wouldn't come back to me after being with someone else. I tried to explain the risks, not just to our relationship, but also the potential for disease, heartbreak, and everything else that could go wrong. None of it seemed to matter. Stephanie was convinced Colleen was right, and nothing I said could change her mind. Out of sheer frustration, I called Dell and explained the situation. She was just as shocked as I had been. Dell promised to talk to Stephanie and try to knock some sense into her. A few days later, Stephanie came home after meeting with Dell. Her face was flushed, and she looked angry. She told me they'd had a fight and exchanged harsh words. "You're pathetic for running to Dell and telling her about this," she snapped. "Now everyone will know." Even with the tension between us, Stephanie and I were still physically intimate almost every night. It didn't feel like enough to bridge the growing gap between us, though. I still loved her deeply, just as much as I had when we first married, but I couldn't shake the fear of what might happen if she followed through with her plan. If she actually slept with another man, I wasn't sure how I'd handle it, or if our marriage would survive. The dreaded conversation came on a Thursday evening. Stephanie had just come home from work and was in the middle of preparing dinner when she suddenly stopped, turned to me and said, I've invited a man over tomorrow night. He's coming to the house so I can be with him. I'm giving you notice. You can either stay and watch or go out, and I'll tell you about it later." Her words left me frozen. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Her words were final, unwavering. "I've made up my mind, and nothing you say will change it." I was completely shattered. If she was truly going to go through with this insane plan, I had at least hoped she'd choose a motel or somewhere else. Anywhere but our home. How could she bring someone into the very space we had built together? Incredibly, she carried on preparing dinner as though nothing monumental was happening. We ate together in almost complete silence, though she kept up light-hearted chatter about everything except what was looming the next night. I couldn't muster a single word. My appetite had vanished, and the meal felt like it stretched on forever. After we cleared the table and settled on the couch to watch television, she curled up beside me, resting her head on my shoulder. "I love you," she whispered, as if her words could ease the chaos in my mind. "I hope you can understand and accept what I'm doing." Understand? Accept? The audacity of it all left me speechless. When the show ended, she took my hand, led me to the bedroom, and started undressing. I followed mechanically, still trying to wrap my mind around the situation. After we both freshened up and got into bed, she moved close to me and said she wanted us to make love. I stared at her, unable to hide the pain in my voice. "How do you expect me to feel, knowing you're planning to sleep with another man tomorrow?" She brushed my concern aside. "It's just a learning experience," she said matter-of-factly, as though that made it all okay. She insisted she loved me, but when I begged her to reconsider, she held firm. "I've already made up my mind," she repeated, shutting down any hope I had left. That night I didn't sleep at all. I tossed and turned, haunted by thoughts of what was to come. Morning couldn't arrive fast enough, but even then, my pleas fell on deaf ears. Stephanie reiterated her plan. She would leave work early, come home to prepare herself, and then meet this man. She asked whether I wanted to stay and watch or go out, as if either option could be remotely acceptable. All night I had struggled with that very question. Could I bear to watch her with another man? The alternative, leaving her alone with a stranger, seemed just as unbearable. When I asked her what she preferred, she smiled as though the answer were obvious. "Of course I want you there," she said. "I'd much rather you see everything than wonder about what's happening. I love you, and I want you forever." I couldn't believe how calmly she said it. It was as though my wife was a stranger to me now. Resigned to what seemed inevitable, I asked about the man. She told me his name was Will, someone she had been introduced to through Colleen. "Colleen said he's the best lover she's ever had," Stephanie added nonchalantly. "But she's found others who are just as good now." My day at work was a disaster. I couldn't focus on anything. My mind was consumed with thoughts of Stephanie and the madness that lay ahead. By early afternoon, I gave up entirely. I told my staff I was taking an early break and wouldn't be back until next week. Then I headed straight home, driven by a mix of dread and desperation. When I arrived, the house seemed quiet. For a moment, I wondered if she'd changed her mind, but that hope quickly faded. As I walked down the hallway, the bathroom door opened, and there she was, fresh from the shower, standing in front of me. "How do I look?" she asked, as if this were just another date night. Stephanie had always been stunning, tall, with perfect proportions for her height. I'd fallen for her beauty as much as her charm. And now, even in this heartbreaking moment, I couldn't help but tell her she looked incredible. She smiled, but I could see her excitement mounting, and it only deepened my despair. Once again, I begged her to reconsider. "Please don't do this," I pleaded. But her response was the same as before. "I've made up my mind," she said firmly. She then dressed in a sleek black mini dress that reminded me painfully of what she'd worn on our first date. It felt like a cruel reminder of better days. Trying one last time, I told her, "If you go through with this, you know I might leave you." Her expression didn't falter. "I don't think you'd be that silly," she replied confidently. I swallowed the lump in my throat and resolved that I would prove her wrong if it came to that. At precisely 7 p.m., the doorbell rang. I watched as Stephanie's face lit up with nervous anticipation. She turned to glance at me, her excitement betrayed by a slight twitch in her expression. Then she opened the door and in stepped Will, a tall, handsome man with a well-groomed appearance. He was large and imposing, yet carried himself with a certain confidence. Stephanie and Will introduced themselves nervously, their awkwardness filling the room. I stood frozen, my mind reeling from the sight of my wife standing so close to another man. The moment I had dreaded was now unfolding right in front of me. When Will extended his hand to greet Stephanie, I couldn't help but think how absurd it was. The irony of them introducing themselves with a handshake, only to follow it up by sleeping together, was almost too much to bear. Stephanie turned to introduce Will to me, but I cut her off, nodding to him out of basic politeness before making my stance clear. "What you're doing is wrong," I said firmly. "You should leave immediately." Without waiting for a response, I walked out of the bedroom and headed to the junk room where we kept things we didn't need at the moment but didn't want to throw away. I grabbed 2 suitcases from the mess and marched back to the bedroom. I set them down by the bed and started packing. I yanked my clothes, socks, underwear, and shirts out of the wardrobe and folded them into the cases. Books, CDs, and other personal items followed, quickly filling the empty spaces. It was a chaotic blur, but I managed to get everything I owned packed within minutes. Once I was done, I stood up and looked at Stephanie. "I never thought it would come to this," I told her, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "You've disgraced me and our marriage. I hope you can live with what you've done because I can't. Our marriage is over. I'll be speaking to my lawyer and filing for divorce. From now on, you can do whatever you want. If you want to stay in this house, the rent is your responsibility. I'm done." For the first time, I saw genuine concern flash across Stephanie's face. "Darling, this is just an experiment," she said desperately. "There's nothing between Will and me. It's not serious. Surely you can't leave me over this." I picked up the suitcases and paused at the door. "From the day I met you until yesterday, I loved you more than I thought possible," I said, my voice breaking. "But you've betrayed me in a way I can't forgive. This is the end. I don't ever want to see you again." With those final words, I walked out of the bedroom, out of the house, and out of her life. I didn't have any trouble finding a motel for the night, and I booked a room for a week. Once inside, I unpacked my things and did my best to turn the space into a temporary home. It wasn't much, but it would do for now. What mattered most was that I was away from her. The next morning, I went to work as usual, though my mind was far from the tasks at hand. An hour into the day, I called all the staff into the main office for a meeting. I announced that Stephanie and I had separated and asked them not to mention her in my presence from that point on. I also instructed the receptionist not to forward any calls from her to me. The room fell silent. Everyone knew how close Stephanie and I had been, and my announcement clearly shocked them. The awkwardness was palpable, and for the rest of the day, the staff seemed hesitant to even speak to me, likely out of fear of saying the wrong thing. By the 3rd day, I realized I couldn't stay in the office like this. I called another meeting and informed the team that I was taking 3 weeks of leave effective immediately. My closest colleague came to my office afterward and closed the door behind him. He sat down and said, "I'm sorry for what you're going through. Taking some time off is probably a good idea. You should consider getting out of the city for a while. Clear your head." As he stood to leave, he turned back and added, "Julie's been handling it well, but she's taken over 40 calls from Stephanie since Monday. She's doing her best to block them, but it's been tough on her. She'll be relieved once you're truly out of reach." Hearing that Stephanie was trying so hard to contact me surprised me, but it didn't change anything. I had already contacted my lawyer and asked him to expedite the divorce. He explained there were mandatory waiting periods and legal complexities, but I urged him to move as quickly as possible. The next day, I left for a 2-week cruise. It was exactly what I needed, a chance to escape. I met plenty of new people, but I avoided forming any close connections. Trust, even in myself, felt like a foreign concept. I knew I needed time to heal before I could even think about moving on. A year has passed since then, and the divorce is finalized. Stephanie and I are no longer tied together in any way. In that time, I've met a kind and understanding woman. She's in no rush for permanence, which suits me just fine. But even in our intimate moments, thoughts of Stephanie creep into my mind. To cope, I've created a mental image of Stephanie with another man, a way to force her out of my thoughts. It's not ideal, but it works for now. I've heard stories of men encouraging their wives to be with other partners, and I can't understand it. It's not about religion or morality. I just don't see how real love can survive that kind of betrayal. Stephanie's shadow still lingers, but I'm hopeful that time will bring peace. Thank you for listening to my story. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more. Take care.